Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to get started with our webinar today. So thank you for joining us for the Transforming the Conversation about STIs when Working with Youth webinar hosted by Healthcare Education and Training with your presenters, Khadijah Cooper and Lauren Lenzen. My name is Megan Arias. I'm the Training and Organizational Development Manager here at HCET, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. So I'm going to briefly introduce you to Healthcare Education and Training. Our mission is to provide comprehensive program development, education, and training to improve reproductive and sexual health outcomes. And we're an organization of passionate people who are proactive in their belief that access to evidence-based, medically accurate reproductive and sexual health education, training, and care is a fundamental right. So this webinar does have closed captioning available, and to enable those, you're going to hover over your main screen. At the bottom, it should say, I believe it says show captions. We need to change this. I believe it says live transcript on your screen, but it should say show captions at the bottom. You click that, and then your caption should pop up, and you're able to change settings to that by clicking subtitle settings within that button. So throughout the presentation, we encourage you to send your questions via the Q&A box. And to submit a question, you can hover over that main screen again and click Q&A. And then an additional box will pop open where you can submit your question. You can submit your question anonymously through Q&A. And we'll hold all questions till the end. And if you have anything throughout, please submit it through the Q&A. Please be sure to follow us on our various social media accounts to keep up to date with the newest information and events. So now just a quick little review of some housekeeping information. A link to the evaluation for this event will be sent to you in the chat at the end of this webinar, as well as in an email later today. Your feedback is greatly appreciated, as it is how we use that information to transform and create our webinars moving forward. And you can find a list of archived presentations and upcoming events in our website. And if you have any technical difficulties during this presentation, you can message myself or you can email updates@hct.org and we can get whatever you need sorted. So now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Khadijah brings over 10 years of experience implementing community-driven and inclusive education programming for young people, parents and caregivers, and professionals. As a leader in the health and education fields, she is committed to pursuing forward the values of public health while cultivating an environment where everyone feels seen and heard. And Khadijah was recognized as a local public health hero by the Minneapolis Health Department in 2022. And then we have Lauren. Lauren supports young people as they learn how they are and how they care for their health. A passionate educator with 20 years of experience, she is completing a Bachelor of Science degree in Public Health Education from St. Catherine University. She regularly speaks on a wide range of sexuality topics, including principles of positive youth development, so caregivers and youth serving professionals can support healthy adolescent sexuality. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our presenters for today.
There we go. Unmute. Thank you. Good afternoon. I hope everyone has an opportunity to get something to eat, has a nice beverage, water, coffee, tea, whatever gets you through this afternoon with us today. So welcome to Transforming the Conversation about STIs when working with youth. Just as a side note, I have a second screen and I have some notes on my desk. So if I'm looking down and around, that's what's going on there. So first and foremost, we just want to let you all know where we work. So we work at a place called the Annex Teen Clinic. We are located in Robbinsdale, Minnesota, which is a suburb of Minneapolis. We are a non-judgmental, confidential, inclusive sexual health clinic for young people up until their 26th birthday. So all the services that we provide in our clinic are reproductive health related. So that includes birth control, STI testing, pregnancy testing, pap smears, annuals, things like that. And if you want to know more information about our clinical services, please feel free to visit our website. And then we also do education. So we're in schools, in our community, providing evidence based, evidence informed sexual health education. So introductions, who are we? Again, thank you, Megan, for that awesome introduction. But in addition, Lauren and I want to start this off with really letting you all know where we sit in our identities as well as the professional side of us as well. It's important that when we are having this conversation working in sexual health that we acknowledge our identities that we bring to this work. This work for a lot of us is personal. A lot of this work really encompasses some of the values that we have not only in the organizations or the institutions that we work for, but also our personal values as well. As we have this conversation today, acknowledge that, different stuff may come up for folks. And acknowledging where we are in our identity is really important because the lens that I have to this work is based in my identity, history, my lived experience. And so our hope is that as we are talking today, we are being transparent in the lens that we're coming from, and also thinking about how our identities might be helpful or limiting as we present to you today. All identities come with power and vulnerability, and we welcome all of those things today. So again, my name is Khadijah Cooper. My pronouns are she, her, and I am in my 40s. I am a Black woman. I work in the community that I grew up in, and I am parenting a child who is now in their 20s. And I was a mother at the age of 21. And all of those beautiful, unique parts of my identity is what I bring to this work.
And I'm Lauren. My pronouns are she and her. I have to get used to saying I'm middle-aged. I'm in my 40s now as well. And I'm a white woman working in public health. And while I have a lot of experience with facilitation and education, I didn't go to school to work in public health until I was a full-grown adult. So I also bring to this my identity as somebody who didn't belong in school. I've now learned that I can say that I have learning disabilities, but I mean, it's just one of the ways that my worldview shaped where I belong and where I don't belong. I also identify as a queer, cisgender woman and a lifelong Midwesterner. I'm, in fact, the child of German immigrants who, of course, were part of the colonization of this area as well. But I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So thank you. This is just a practice that we think is helpful as we have this conversation. And we invite you to kind of think about the same as you are moving forth in your day and working with young people and colleagues as well, is how your identity shapes how you do the work. Okay, so what we're doing today, our agenda. So we have our grounding. That's what we're doing right now. We're going to look at some data, maybe not in a way that folks typically think about data in webinars. It's not really going to be based in STI rates and what that means. Lauren's going to take us through that. We're going to talk about myths young people have about STIs. I think it's really important to start there. What do young people think about STIs, and how can we transform the conversation that we're having to make sure we are debunking those myths and validating their experience? We're going to talk about positive youth development. Positive youth development is fundamental to how we do our work here at the Annex, and we really intersect it with all the things that we do, including how we're having conversations with young people. And we're going to do that intersection for you today, so you don't have to do that work. We're going to talk about sexual decision making in young people. What's important to think about, specifically around this development age and how to have the conversations. And then we'll have about 15 minutes, maybe a little more time for Q&A. And, Lauren and I love conversation. We love people leading with curiosity around this. So please, I invite you to put all your questions in the chat. We love that. And we'll definitely have time for that at the end. Another part of the grounding that feels really important to us is like we want to let you know where our journey begins today. So these are just three things that we pulled out. So like this is where we're starting from. And if anything that I'm saying or where we're starting from feels in contention within you or maybe feeling at odds, just think about that a little bit. Have a moment to reflect. And I invite you to think about why that is. And we would love to have a conversation with you all about that in the end. So the first thing that where we're starting from is effectively addressing STIs should be more than getting tested, use of condoms, and the idea of like just don't have sex, right? We're not sitting here saying that these ideas are wrong or bad, but there has to be more of just than telling young people don't have sex, use a condom, and get tested, right? There are so many nuances, so much beautiful, unique experience that goes within that, and we want to acknowledge that and kind of give other people tips and tools on how to address STIs in addition to just get tested, use a condom, and don't have sex. Um, Also, adolescents are experts in their own experience. That is something we truly have a value here at the Annex. And, sometimes adults are like, well, I have a lot of lived experience. And like, that is so true. And we just can't possibly know everything that's going on with a young person that we're interfacing with during our workday, right? So if a young person shares their experience, and they're making decisions that maybe we're like, oh, this feels unhealthy or maybe harmful, but we have to understand that young people are making the best decisions that they can at the time. And that doesn't mean we're not giving them guidance and information so that they can make informed decisions. I want to be really clear about that. You serving professionals are always, there are always things that we need to learn, and there's always things we need to unlearn. I'm constantly doing this every single day. Things that I've learned from my own lived experience that I have to like let go of, and things that I'm picking up from young people along the way. One thing that we are really, moving forward is thinking about how we're using the word prevention, right? Preventing STIs, preventing young people from contracting or giving STIs. And when we really think about that and dive deep into it, when we are saying preventing STIs, who is that excluding? Like that could potentially be excluding people who are already living with STIs, who also need this information to make informed decisions about their health and the health of their partner or partners. So, we're not perfect. I may say it even today, preventing STIs, but we are trying to use different language, and hopefully you'll see that modeled here during our time together. Okay.
So as we get started, and we're just thinking about talking to young people about this, I wanted to just gauge a temperature of the room and invite you all to put in the chat an emoji that represents how you feel about talking to adolescents about STIs, right? People come with different backgrounds, experiences, and I imagine you all are working in these fields in various ways. So I invite you to pop in the chat an emoji that just represents how you feel about talking about this topic, specifically with our target age group. Oh, great. I'm seeing some people are excited and feel cool about it. Great. Oh, I saw a silly one. I am a big believer. I work in classrooms a lot. One of my favorite age ranges is to work with middle schoolers, in part because they can embrace the silly. This is great. Thank you all for sharing. And I know they're going to keep coming in. So I just want to give you a heads up that as we talk about data, right? Because that is often, data is something that we use to try and understand, right? Understand what actually is, like, what is the nature of things. We try to understand patterns. We try to understand, you could say, just basic facts, right? And so I just want to tell you where I'm coming from, and that is that as much as the facts, the data, the science matters, in many of our jobs, what matters most is how we're actually understood. So we may want information to understand, but it's just as important that the people we're talking to can understand us. And so we wanted to frame our approach to the data through the lens of how do we talk about it with young people? How do we use this to and how do we share this information in hopes of being understood? What's on the screen right now is kind of, you could say, maybe where we're coming from. This is, of course, an infographic from the CDC. I think it's got some useful information on it, but I also think there's some stuff here that I think can sometimes get in the way when it comes to how I'm often talking to young people about this data. The first thing is, I think there's just a lot going on here, right? We have a lot of information, and often with young people, like Khadijah said, they're the experts in their own lives, and so I think making things relevant, targeted, specific. And in some ways, our job might be to have a lot of information, but only share a very tiny piece of it based on what we are learning or interpreting or find out about the people that we're talking to. So I think this is more than we need. A couple things I want to highlight that I think are really great about this. In the upper left-hand corner, we've got 1 in 5 people in the US have an STI. I love that that's using simple statistics, right? Rather than saying 20%, I think from a data communication standpoint, this is going to be a lot more approachable for people. And in the lower right corner, I really like that it's directly addressing kind of young people in risk with something that feels really maybe fundamental or easy to grasp, right? When we say that almost half of new STI infections were in people aged 15 to 24 in the US, I think many young people can easily kind of be like, but wait, we're not half of the population, right? It's fundamental to their experience, right? Where they get to take up space and don't, where they have power, where they fit into the world, particularly as they age. And so I like that this is kind of taking something they probably already know or feel and layering on top of that with something like this half number. I also want to point out something. I have a couple tips I'm going to show you in a second, but something that I really like about here is that it's really clear, or is at least shining a light on some really fundamental pieces of data literacy, right? Namely the like who, what, where, when, right? And like data doesn't make sense without a lot of that information. And so oftentimes, I think it's important to check with young people about what they think about what we're sharing with them. And with figures like this, I frequently will get young people who comment on like, this is in 2018. Don't you have something newer? Like, oh, could things be different? Like, is this about people in my area or is this the whole country? And sometimes educators will tell me that that feels like a point of possible conflict. And I would actually encourage people to transform that and look at that as a wonderful opportunity to validate where young people are coming from, what they're thinking about their perspectives. And it's an opportunity to share an important piece of health literacy, which is data literacy, right? And so you can explain maybe why we don't have newer stuff or add extra context, right? It's just a jumping off point to continue the conversation. So when we think about sharing this data with young people, Khadijah, we can pop to the next slide. These are kind of some tips or a framework that I think is really helpful to think about. And I wanted to just walk you all through an example. Again, more of my experience is in the classroom. And so I want to walk you through an example of what sharing this data could look like in a classroom. I think it's important to start with what do they already know, right? So in a classroom, it's often something like raise your hand if you think people your age are at a higher risk for STIs. I have a whole host of other examples. If you want other questions or ways that you can solicit their feedback, let us know and we can totally go over that in the Q&A. And then often I am going to add a piece of, if I think there's needed, important context, which there often is, before I maybe give an answer, right? We're starting with what do they already know, and then we're going to build on that or add on to that. So typically before I answer their question in a class on STIs or specifically HIV, I'm also going to be like, wanting to make sure that they understand how infections work, right? Infections are a function of community, right? If you ask them, say if you have a cold, who's most likely to get that cold from you? Most young people are going to very quickly be like, oh, well, the people I see all the time. And you're like, that's right, because infections are caused by, pathogens or things that need humans to survive that live in us. And so that means that we only have infections when we are part of a community. It also means, right, that if an infection shows up in a community and that community doesn't have access to healthcare, they don't have the education or other resources that they need, right, then it's going to be more likely that that infection might stay in that community, right? That feels like valuable context, particularly for young people, because we are often sharing with them data that is specific to their communities, right? I think it's really helpful when we're sharing data here to try to get local or specific to a targeted age range or even community data. We here use a lot of information from the U of M's Department of Healthy Youth Development. Jill Ferris does a state of adolescent sexual health in Minnesota right every year, and perhaps your state has those sort of things as well. We also are all familiar with, like the CDC for surveillance report, but trying to drill in to share information that feels either more relevant or more targeted to them, I think is really important. So, if I'm going to answer the question I've just asked of, do you think young people are at a higher risk, right? I can say, yes, they are, right? And I can share information like, here in our area for people your age, right? We know that every two new cases of chlamydia are in people 15 to 24, right? We know that 1 out of every 3 new cases of gonorrhea are in people your age and young adults. And with HIV, we see 1 in 5 new cases, right? I know it can sometimes be hard to talk about STIs as a big category. And so sometimes this is also a chance to be clear about what we do and what we don't know, right? It can be really hard to give concrete numbers about every STI, right? Whereas we also can be really specific and we can be clear about why, right? We're going to talk about gonorrhea and chlamydia because in the last decade, we've seen a big rise and we've seen it in people your age. And because infections are a function of community, right? That means then that young people are more likely to give it to other young people, right? We see outbreaks that move through a school or a community. And this also allows you to add context to, the common phrase we use, like most common symptom is no symptom at all. I think this also allows you to say like, well, when we look at who has symptoms, we see that most people, right, 9 out of 10 people don't have symptoms, particularly that can, like with chlamydia, for example, I know that can vary with different infections, but if most people don't have symptoms, well, then a lot of young people aren't going to know that they need to get tested. And that's just a way of adding that context or trying to take something that we would otherwise think of as like a data point and try to make it more relevant to them. I think it's important that we always remember that regardless of our intent, our numbers are still telling a story. And I'm going to talk more about that with our next slide. But since we started with checking in with young people, I just want to say I always think it's great to end with checking in with young people. So if I've asked them what they think, I've shared a piece of information, I can say, what do y'all think of this? And again, often they might push back and say, well, how do we know this? But that's still a great opportunity to help them build skills for navigating, making sense of their world. So Khadija, why don't you put that next slide up? And I want us to think a little bit about when I say that, remember that numbers still tell stories. I think an important thing to ask ourselves is like, what is the space that we're in when we're sharing, right? So I often ask the question of, is this a space primed for blame? Because I'm in a lot of schools and a lot of people, there's some high pressure social dynamics going on in schools. And so if you're in a space that's primed for blame, well, then you have to ask, who's to blame in what I'm talking about? And I want you to consider what the impact might be if we put up a slide or share a graph or something like this with somebody without any scaffolding or framework, without any care about how we introduce this information. And I think when we are sharing information, particularly that relates to identity, because that's often how STI numbers are structured, right? We're looking at where are we seeing bigger concentrations of these infections. I think we also have to be really careful that we aren't blaming individuals, or we aren't playing into stories that already exist that blame individuals for their own experiences. One piece of unlearning that sometimes we need to have is even just the connection between rates and risk, right? Rates of infections are talking about something that exists in the world right now. And many times we're talking to young people about their risk of what might happen to them in the future. And I think putting up something like this, even if we mean to inform them, we need to also consider, like, is this instead going to seem like it's blaming them? Is this instead going to come across as because, say, you are Black or you are American Indian and you live in this area, you're more likely to get this? And we can differ in how we want to phrase this, but I think that sometimes that oversimplified phrasing really doesn't help us, because it isn't going to build connection and it isn't personalized. It's not allowing us to talk to young people about navigating the things they can impact, right? Their behavior, their choices, their approach. And so next up, I wanted to share with you some of those misconceptions that Khadijah talked about that young people have around STIs. These are things we've collected from other educators, from our clinic staff. And I think this can be really helpful when you are trying to think about, right, you want to determine what data you're sharing, what you need to provide more clarity on, right? And even thinking about what story you're telling, right? So if there's a prevalent perception that monogamy protects against STIs, right? Maybe then we don't need to share the standard talking point that, like, many people are familiar with in terms of STI prevention, right? Is that idea that, well, for every new partner you have, there's increased risk. And while that statement is true, if people already have a perception, well, monogamy will protect me, well, then how is that statement landing, right? Is that really having the desired effect? You guys are going to get a copy of these slides, so you can read through all of these. But Khadijah, if you pop to the next slide, you also will get to see some of these student anonymous questions. There's even a link at the bottom of the slide to an album, a Google album I made, because oh boy, I couldn't limit myself to just a couple. But here, like you can see in the upper left-hand corner, there's a comment that says, 2 people with no sexual history mate for life, aren't they safe from STIs? And I think you can see, again, kind of how that oversimplification sometimes trickles down into a misconception that really could negatively or not fully prepare a young person for making decisions that are in alignment with, kind of building the life that they want. So we're going to return to some more things you can do later on, but Khadijah is going to walk us through kind of why are we even suggesting to do things this way?
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. I think that's a great transition into where young people are coming from within their curiosity and what our role is in that, and like what young people need to be able to make informed decisions. And that's a role that we get to play. So let's dive into development and adolescence. So when I think about development and adolescence, especially being in Minnesota, I always like to just highlight Kanapka and the Kanapka Institute. And the work that she did in the 70s at the University of Minnesota, of social work. And her work really set a national agenda for promoting the health and well-being of young people. And the reason why I always like to call this up is, when I step outside of my public health, kind of safety zone, I think a lot of adults are like, kids these days need all this stuff. Kids these days. And actually, what this is really highlighting is that this was developed in the 70s. And when I show you the 8 critical elements of healthy development, they're pretty timeless. They are things that young people will need until the end of time. There are things that young people will need 20 years from now. A 15-year-old will need this no matter if it was in the 70s, the 80s, or the 2030s. So what are those things? First on the list is young people need to feel safety and they need to have structure. And what does that look like in the work that you do with young people? Are you a clinician? Are you working one-on-one with a young person in a clinic setting? Are you working in a school? I think all of these can kind of be taken and really transition into a way that we can kind of hold some of this stuff for young people and provide them with these things. Not all of them, and that's not a response, not every single one, right? But which one feels you really pull to and can commit to. So think about that as we go through this. Youth experience, active participation, group membership, and belonging. All humans need to feel a sense of belonging. That is what we need. But in adolescence, that is really heightened developmentally. At Within adolescence, young people, as you work with young people, they are feeling really self-conscious about their classmates or in the community that they're in, and so they really want to belong. And so how can we provide that for young people? Develop self-worth through meaningful contribution. Young people have to have a stake in the game. When we do youth groups, we really want young people to, for example, create the group agreements because then they have some stake in it, right? They have some ownership of it, and that's really important for their development to build that up in them during adolescence. Youth experiment to discover self, gain independence, and gain control over one's life. I'm sure we can all think of examples where we see this highlighted maybe in young people in our own personal life and the young people that we partner with and work with. Youth develop significant and quality relationship with peers and adults. Really important again. Youth discuss conflicting values and form their own. Adolescence is a time in a young person's life where they are figuring out what their values are around the world. I think young people, what I've noticed is they have such an upswing in information. They have an upswing in like what's happening in the world. And so they are creating their own values really, really quickly. I come from a time where I had to look at an encyclopedia to know what happened or read a newspaper to know what happened in the world. And young people have these things on their phone at a click of a button. So whenever they see what's happening in the world, they are creating their own personal values around these things quickly. um, Youthful pride and competence and mastery. Uh, Youth expand their capacity to enjoy life and know that success is possible. I think I stand on a soapbox about the last one. I don't think enough young people, especially older young people, have enough time to experience joy and know that their dreams and the things that they want in life are possible, especially if they live in a community or maybe have an identity that is really contradicting what this is saying, right? So what role do we have in that to disrupt that? Because we have a role, even if you're providing an STI test to a young person in a clinic, there is a way to provide that and be like, you know what, you coming in here today is showing that you want to have a successful relationship. You don't want to pass on STI. If you have one and you want to know your status, really quick ways to build that up in a young person. So as time has gone on, this has been updated in different ways. Something that maybe folks are more familiar with is the 5 C's of positive youth development. But when we think about connection, confidence, character, caring, contribution, and competence. These are all the things that we kind of see in the previous slide with Kanapka's work, right? Young people need to feel connected. Young people need to feel confident that they're able to make decisions. But to make a decision, what do they need? Information. They need to understand what the outcomes can be, right? They need things from the adults in their lives so that they can make an informed decision. Character. What opportunities do we have to build up a young person's character, really connecting to those character traits that are positive, that we see we want them to flourish on and move through a little bit more. Caring, having sympathy and empathy for others. When we think about a conversation about STIs, think about how important this can be in that conversation, right? If a young person cares about themselves and we're building that up in a young person, then the hope is like they'll care about their partner and they'll be able to have these conversations with their partner or partners. Contribution. When we partner with young people, how much of it is this is what you need to do because I'm the adult and I'm the expert, or how much of this is here's some options for you. What feels good to you? What is something that you can commit to? Can you commit to using a condom every single time with your partner? Can you commit to getting tested? Or can you commit to having a conversation with your partner and um, not punishing them, so to speak, because they don't give an answer that feels the safest or the healthiest as an adult. But what are they saying that can really be helpful for them to reach those goals that they want? Um, Thinking about competence again, they have to have the information. If we're safeguarding information about STIs, if we're safeguarding information about how to protect themselves, if we're safeguarding tips on how to have these conversations with their partners, which is hard to do, then we're not providing them with everything that they need to be successful. We have to give them the buffet and be like, what part of this meal feels good to you? And again, connection. So thinking about how positive youth development intersects with conversations and education on STIs. The thing that I love about this presentation is we're really layering it. Lauren did an amazing job talking about here's the data, here's like the hard numbers facts, talking about youth development and what young people need, which is so important when we have this conversation. It's always at the base. But then how do we intersect those two things? So here's some examples, and I'm sure as I was reading Kanaka's list, some things came up for you. But the examples that I want to share with you is the one of the elements, youth experiment to discover self, gain independence, and gain control over one's life. When we think about that specifically around STIs, for a lot of young people, this may be the first time they're navigating the healthcare system independently. When we see young people come to the annex, this may be their first time even making an appointment by themselves. Think of an adolescent, right? And so they're experimenting, they're gaining independence, right? They're also discovering a little bit about what their value is about STIs. We know when young people come to get tested, they have a value. There is something that brought them into wanting to get tested. So they value knowing, they value their body and what that means to them, right? There's a value that goes into that. The second one that I pulled is feel pride and competence and mastery. So this can happen in the classroom, right? Lauren is in the classrooms all the time, providing them with information and providing them with skills so that they can feel confident. Sometimes that looks like a role play, having young people be able to kind of like fake have a conversation if they want to have like safer sex or practice safer sex practices. Um, Again, just like the confidence to get tested, to be like, oh, maybe I did something that put me at risk. Now I have the information, and it makes me feel good to know that I'm going to go to the clinic and get tested, for example. Youth discuss conflicting values and form their own. Again, adolescence is a time where young people are quickly developing that critical thinking skill, and because that's not something that we have. It's something that has to be developed and that is being developed in adolescence. Um, Feeling confident to discuss safer sex practices with their partner is also important, right? If young people don't have what they need to have those conversations, is one young person engaging in behavior that they actually aren't comfortable with, that is actually in conflict with their own values? At the Annex, we truly believe that we are able to provide space for young people to explore their values, but it's not our role to tell them what their values should be. That is the role of family, parents, caregivers. That is not the role of the Annex educators. But what we can do is give them opportunities to think about what their values are around safer sex practices. And when we're able to do that, then they're more confident into maintaining those boundaries. When they understand what their values are, they're able to communicate them to others. If I don't know what my value is around a certain topic, how can I tell my partner what it is? So having young people have that opportunity is really important when we think about having the conversation with STIs. So think about how that can look in a clinic, right? Um, how we can do that in a classroom, how we can do that in a small group or in a school setting. So now just thinking a little bit more about, you know, this is what young people need. Here's how we can talk about the data. Um, Another example of like what young people need to be healthy and to support their well-being. But thinking about where they are developmentally, thinking about behavior change theories, there's a lot of them. But the one that I like that really to me encompasses adolescence is a trans theoretical model or the stages of change. So basically the overview is suggests behavior change occurs in stages, doesn't happen all at once. We have pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. And what does this look like with young people? What does this look like in adolescence, particularly around having a conversation about STIs? So, pre contemplation, raising awareness about STIs and the importance of protection or what their options are for protection. So, as a young person is thinking about, like, yep, I'm thinking about being sexually active. I don't want to get an STI. How can we provide them with information? Sometimes the information is helpful. Young people are like, I want to know the numbers. So the information Lauren shared at the beginning can be really, really helpful. Sometimes they're like, I want to know how to use a condom. So actually practicing those skills. Contemplation. Encourage reflection on how behavior impacts health and relationships. So, thinking about how having a conversation with your partner can impact your relationship. For some young people, that can be really scary. I don't want to have a conversation with my partner. Or for some young people, having a conversation could actually make us closer together. And then talking to young people about, well, whose responsibility is it for you to feel healthy, for you to take mastery over your own body? And then we always like to tell young people the hope is that you're in a relationship where people will respect your boundaries, will respect your values, and the things that and the things that you want and need in this relationship and within sexual behavior. Uh, Preparation, provide resources like condoms and sites to get tested. That's important. If we do all this work with young people about giving them the information but they don't know where to go to get what they need, then we're also doing them a disservice, right? So making sure like young people know where clinics are. There's a great website called Myself My Health that really is made for young people. It has drop down boxes so young people can put where they're located, what type of services they want, and the services on that website go beyond sexual health. And all of those clinics have been like secret shop by young people to say like these clinics are youth friendly. So that's just one example of how you can provide information to young people. Action, support youth in adopting harm reducing behaviors, right? So it's not like use a condom every single time, but really having a conversation with young people around, using a condom, not having sex, talking to your partner, getting tested, what feels like something you can do right now. And really laying out the options is like one's not necessarily better than the other, but like let's like have a plan, because having a plan is so important when we think about young people making the best decisions for themselves. I think we can all think of a time in our adolescence where we did not have a plan and it got us in some sticky situation. But think about if you had a plan before you went to that outdoor concert, then you wouldn't have been stuck in the rain or whatever. That didn't happen to me. Maybe it did. Okay. Yeah. So this can also provide an opportunity for young people to have a plan to go back to, right? I always like to say if you think about your values before and your boundaries before and you have a plan, at least you have something to go back to, and then you have the resources and the support from a trusted adult as well. Um Maintenance, reinforce habits through ongoing education and accessible resources. So the way that this can look at the annex, if a young person, calls and wants to know their test results and being like, like great job following up. This, I can see that's really important to you. There is so many opportunities that we can provide young people with that positive youth development piece and build up that character. Because think about young people who go through their whole day, week, maybe even month, and they don't have anybody doing that. And one person saying you're doing a good job because you showed up today could really shift the behavior that they're engaging in or how they think about it moving forward. I know it sounds really simple and like, Khadijah, really one thing. I've seen it. I've seen the impact of saying, you're not a bad kid. I'm glad you're here today, and how that changed the way a young person moved in a classroom, for example. So don't never underestimate a few simple affirmations for young people. Because it goes a long way. And developmentally, they soak that stuff up like a sponge. They really need it, especially because in their development, they're so self conscious about themselves. So having an adult say you're doing a good job and mean it and have it be authentic and have it feel like it's really for them, about them, personal, goes a long way. Um, Also, just, as we all know, change is not linear. They're not going to go from pre contemplation all the way through maintenance, right? They may go from action to again back to pre contemplation, and that's completely normal. As a reminder, adolescence is a time where young people developmentally just need to take risk. And how can we listen to the risk that they're taking as an adult and redirect that? This is a time in adolescence, again, where they're developing critical thinking skills. This is important. This is a time in adolescence where all sorts of things are happening, right? They're testing, they're trying to figure out how to learn, they're learning how to be in relationship, they're learning about their values all at once. In addition to school, work, all of the other things they have going on. And just remember that in adolescence, their relationships, their peer relationships, sexual, romantic, all of those things are at the top of importance for them. So the more that we can support them in these relationships, the better and healthier and well-being young people will be, because developmentally it is the thing that matters to them the most. And it's the thing that got disrupted the most during the pandemic. I always like to bring that up as well. So we've talked about a lot. And so Lauren's going to talk about connecting with adolescents, supporting healthy sexual development.
Um, Khadijah, I love when you're talking about like where they are developmentally, like what is going on in their brains, but also like what is important to them. I find that I have to remind myself still, like, oh, right, I can't hotwire their learning, right? It's risks, like you said, risks are part of this process. And so, how do we provide support? But ultimately, they're the ones who are going to have to learn things. And we learn things by doing. And if we enter into a situation where we're guaranteed success, like that's not really learning. We already know everything, right? So risk, that's helpful for me too, to remind myself of that. So I wanted to wrap up by just talking about a few more specifics about how we can tailor what we're doing to where young people are developmentally. Because so much of the adolescent age is about their development of their sense of self, how they fit into the world. Um, and even early on in development. Sorry, got a little tongue-tied there. Sorry, let me start that over again. So since this part of their life is really about developing not only their sense of self, but their critical thinking skills, right? And especially we see later in adolescence that they are, that's really the time for figuring out their values or morals, right? What matters to them, often with great conviction, right? Some people will talk about the opinionatedness of young people, but like we can harness that. I love being in a classroom and asking them, what did I leave out? What did I get wrong? So being able to validate and play into the strength that this stage is about them getting clear about what they know and what's important to them. Khadijah talked a lot about values. And so the approach of values-based decision making, or how do we support young people in that values development, is one really key area that comes to mind when we were developing this class or this seminar. And this often can happen in individual conversations. It can happen in classrooms. Certainly there are like values exploration activities, but often anytime there's like one-on-one conversation, even if it's just someone asking a question, even anonymously, there's always room for us to highlight the values that might be underpinning an approach, an opinion, or a decision or an action, right? So if someone is talking about choosing prevention methods, right, and they even want to use language around prevention, right, we can talk about that showing a value for health and wellness. We also can, if people are using prevention language, we can say, right, it sounds like you really value having no exposure to STIs or no risk of STIs. Because as we all know, that is going to result in a much smaller list of activities if we want no risk versus some risk, right? So even that ability to consider things in terms of, you know, risk exclusion versus risk reduction, right? When Khadijah talked a lot about how we can build the confidence and reflect the existing responsibility of young people, I think this is super important, in part because they already get a lot of messages about their immaturity, their lack of responsibility, their laziness, their whatever. Like older generations always have things to say about younger generations, but being able to point out, if any of you followed the discourse and how we talk about the withdrawal method, right? This shift from this is a method that doesn't work to this is a method that a lot of young people are using because they're thinking about things like pregnancy prevention. Obviously, today we're talking about STI prevention, but being able to build on that and say, now, who's most likely to be successful with this? Where do we see what can people do to have the most success with this? Or even sharing additional information, right, about how this is going to affect their risks for STIs can be really important, but still treating it as a health promoting behavior, right, as a way of highlighting that they do value responsibility, or they do show and present responsibility in different ways. I always think communication is a great way to highlight the value of respect, right? Communication takes work. And most young people know that, right? So being able to have a communication at any step of the way, even in a classroom, if you're willing to write on a Post-it and put on the board some symptoms you've heard of an STI, right? Like that still is showing that you're like respecting learning about this, right? Respecting this topic and respecting or respecting the effort that it takes to both build information and build skills, particularly if we're talking about communication skills, right? And I think also being able to highlight the value of trust. I hear young people talk all the time about trust, how they're considering who to trust, how does trust work, when has trust been broken? And sometimes being able to break this stuff down into some nuance, right? So it can take some trust to bring this up with a partner. I'm glad that you trusted me, this professional, right, to talk to me. And also just acknowledging that trust is built over time too, so that this isn't like an all or nothing thing. I hope on the next visit, right, I can continue to show you that I'm somebody that you can trust, because I see that that's important to you, right? That people are going to treat you with respect and that you can trust what they say. I also think that values are an important place for us as providers to think about reframing those situations Khadijah had mentioned that can sometimes, maybe for adults, feel kind of challenging. That young person who says, I don't like condoms, I'm not going to use them, right? Can we point out to them, like, I hear that you really value maybe pleasure, right? That is a thing that people can and do and really should value, right? If we don't value pleasurable relationships, well, then it's much more likely people are going to be in unhealthy situations, right? Or hurtful situations. Somebody who's like talking about, again, like, well, monogamy will kind of protect me from STIs, right? Me and my partner, me and my boyfriend, we're monogamous, and I'm taking hormonal birth control, right? And that is my STI protection approach, right? We can reflect back to that person, like, yeah, that's a really common thing that I hear from people. I just want to make sure, right, because you said that you care about your health or the health of your partner, that I just want to be clear that you understand that that model really means that you're putting your safety in the hands of somebody else, right? That in order for this model to provide a reduction of risk or a degree of protection, right, it is every bit as dependent on the other person's behavior as it is on your own. And if they still choose to do that, that's fine. Again, like Khadijah said, we can provide information and guidance. We just are trying to be maybe clear about how are they, or helping them understand their values, and then also trying to provide that important information so that they're making educated decisions, which kind of, I got ahead of myself, is really more on my next slide, which is, again, kind of breaking down what are the individual steps of facilitating or building values-based decision-making, particularly with young people and STIs. I don't need to go through every single one of these. You guys are going to get this. But I just want to really remind you that, like, we can't do it all, right? So you can help with just a piece of this. You can target your efforts into where you see your role, right? You are going to be, I know you're receiving part of our packet. We were sharing one of our educational STI brochures, right? That is, part of that education or that information process. The other resource that we're sharing, I'm going to highlight in just a second, the skills for sexual decision making, right? That is a reflection tool, right? So one thing that can support young people as they reflect. The last three categories from the previous slide would be skills, right? So kind of how are we supporting them in building those skills of navigation, right? We can always do role playing, Khadijah said, or practice talking about something. Something I like to highlight for providing support is something our clinic has done, I know. When they are talking to young people about STIs, they're just really transparent that there are some STIs where it is recommended that people get regular testing. And there's other STIs where we don't do testing unless there's symptoms, right? As a way of just being clear, or even taking recommendations for automatically testing people, right? And involving the young person so that they are able to have the information they need to actually make these decisions, right? I want to keep us moving. I know I didn't talk about the last one, but your community efforts matter whether they are individual or systemic. I'll just leave it with that. So I do want to highlight the skills for sexual decision making, right? This is a handout we're giving. The idea isn't so much that you would go through and ask people every single one of these questions. These are just, again, a way of breaking out this kind of big topic of making a decision. and recognizing that it's made up of different components. And so sometimes we can target in one area. Sometimes we can offer these reflections to young people. Sometimes I've had people go through this reflection tool on themselves, right? To really think about, like, have I ever asked myself all of these questions? Because this can be really personal. And I want to leave enough room for questions, so I will just leave with a little plug for my fabulously talented coworkers. While I do education in the classroom and occasionally with professionals such as yourself, that is an area of expertise and focus for Khadijah, as well as our education program manager, Carissa. Together, they have over 25 years of experience and are really focused on providing education for people who work with youth, right? How can people think about their processes of inclusion or centering or really even partnering and power sharing with young people? So if that's ever something you're interested in, I know you can go to our website, and I think it is hot linked in this slide. But I will stop talking there.
Thank you. Yeah, oh, wait, this is important. Thank you. I genuinely want to send out a thank you to all of you who joined us here today. This is just a piece of the puzzle, right? Hopefully, you're able to walk away with something that you can implement when having these conversations. For the folks in the chat that had the ooh face, hopefully, this kind of helped you move to a different emoji. For the folks who had emojis that I read as like confident, I hope this like just really validated the skills and everything that you have. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing, and thank you for joining us here today. Q&A.
I did see something that came in the chat in the beginning when I mentioned that there are some other suggestions I had for stuff in the classroom. I do see that someone said that they would like more of that. Does that feel like an okay thing for me to start with?
Yeah. Oh, let me. Okay. Navigating.
All of the different screens, right? I really like trying to find low barrier ways for people to share opinions. So another example is you could say something like, if you imagine a group of 100 people your age, how many of them do you think would get a chlamydia infection at the end of a year, right? We could use, the Minnesota data, I think currently says that's at like 59%, right? But if we asked a group of young people, how many of those 100 people do you think would have an infection, right? You can offer people a chance to, like, you can just hold up your hand. If you think, about 10% of the group, right, 10 of them might have it, you could hold up a 1. If you think half of them, 50 of them might have it, you could hold up a 5. If you think everybody's going to have it, you could hold up both hands. That's a way to both use those simple that simplified framing, as well as giving people a way to like share an opinion. I really like asking that similar question around how many of your peers or people your age or people in your grade do you think are having sex? Here in Minnesota, we have the Minnesota Student Survey that they do every 3 years, but I know nationally they have the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And we can share that information with them. And often I think that's a great reflection point. I like that someone said in the chat that they like asking students to consider data, asking them their thoughts and wondering. And often when they have a wondering about, well, how do you know this, or how was this collected? That naturally leads into like, well, do you think some people would have a reason to lie about why they've had sex when they haven't? And do you think some people would lie and say that they hadn't had sex when they had? Oh, so I see that you guys are really dealing with this thing that can maybe feel like these things are in conflict. And then also being able to ask them, yeah, what do you think your peers are doing? Whether that is like using condoms, right? Of the people that say they're having sex, do you think most of them say they're using condoms? Or you can also sometimes bring in birth control too, as a way of talking about sexual health kind of in a larger way.
Thank you. And then Megan, did you want to moderate the other questions? I just want to.
So we have two questions so far. They're relatively the same, but I'll ask both. So I'll start with the first one. How did you get into the classroom setting? Suggestions on getting into the classrooms with district resistance in the recent past.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So first and foremost, just to be really transparent, I always like to say the Annex has been partnering like heavily with Robbinsdale area schools for over 10 years. So there has been a lot of buy-in throughout the time. I think when talking to adults about why this is important, sometimes it is important to look at the data. A lot of things that pique the interest of districts is thinking about if the area that you want to be in has like a national, like a higher than national average for birth rates. That kind of drives some of the funding that we get. So that's also really compelling. um, I also think making it, I think having to kind of craft your message to what feels important to them. If it's health and wellness, if it's um, school, young people being at school, showing up to school, how to craft those messages. Because I truly believe, and I've seen and I've heard from young people that being able to engage in these conversations, they want to come to school because of it, because it matters to them. We have health mentors in the schools, and sometimes young people will say things like, oh, I'm here today because I needed to talk to my health mentor. And I think also making it, people are, really dividing around sexual health, but this is something that everyone needs. Sometimes I also think it's helpful to start with parents. Have a parent night. Talk to parents about this health information. Sometimes even saying the word sexual health is really hard for people to hear, but like relationship health, like really curving that messaging that feels like this is about your priorities. Sometimes I even look at school's mission and values and vision and some of those other things to be like, well, you have a vision that every young person feels safe in your school. I think we really need to do a gender and sexuality lesson for the teachers, for example, right? So really playing on what feels important to the school and how to fit some of this into it. And like my email address is available, and if there's like really specific things that you feel like you're coming up against, I would love to have that conversation. This is something that I'm constantly having to do. We're currently teaching an 11-day curriculum in a health class, and that's tricky. We're taking 11 days from health from their sexual health unit, so that's really tricky. But I think, I always like to say, if you are familiar with motivational interviewing skills, I've used those skills so much in convincing schools, administration, that what we're doing is really helpful and beneficial, because at the end of the day, we all have the same goal, making sure young people are safe and healthy and have what they need, and providing them sexual health information. I'm biased, but it's core to that. I really think that. Yeah. Hopefully that was helpful.
Thank you. And then, like I said, this next question is similar, but if there's anything you wanted to add specifically towards this. Um, so how did you start the conversation with schools slash relationship build with schools? We're finding it difficult to start conversations with schools due to the current atmosphere and this content.
Yeah. Um, I know in every single school there is someone who is really advocating for this. Find them. Find the people in the school, even if it's not an administrator. Sometimes it's helpful to go with like some support staff, social workers. Who this is I'm just gonna say it. Who bears the most burden to help students when they don't get what they need? Social workers, nurses, support staff. Talk to them. And how can the work that we do be in partnership to support the work that you're doing? If it's something that can take the burden off of, individuals in a school, because schools are already stretched so thin. Young people have so many needs, families have so many complex needs. Um, and so really thinking about who is who is having these conversations with young people, who is talking to young people about relationships, is that their role? How can we take the burden off? I always think it's really helpful too if if there's a grant or a financial support, to be completely transparent. For our Robbinsdale schools, we do, through the grant that we have through offensive adolescent health, we pay them $10,000 a year. So that's also something that's like, oh, and if that isn't something that you're able to do, again, go with that first. Think about who has the most burden in the school to support students around the stuff that you can help with. Who are the stakeholders that are really in to having this conversation? Do we want to engage parents first to get them bought in to then go into the schools? And then sometimes if it's really kind of coming at contention, how can we offer these classes in that community separate from that school setting? Is there a community center that's free that you can rent out and to provide this education outside of the school? Is that an option? Yeah, just thinking like really creatively. But if school is the goal, because it's the goal for us, right? We can reach a lot of young people. Really finding that like what we're doing is supporting what you want to do too. What we're doing is providing young people with skills, life skills. What we're doing is providing support, and so like your staff doesn't have to feel so much burden, for example. Hopefully that was helpful.
Also, when I'm in schools, Kitty's is absolutely right. There's always somebody there who is, I was going to say, find the person who's, walking in on the kids doing sexual activities in the bathrooms, right? Like there are people who are on the ground. And so, being able to ask a school, like, well, what are you seeing? Like, what are you experiencing when it comes to consent violations, when it comes to, um, uh, depending on the age, right? Younger kids, like acts of body discovery are really normal. But then with older kids, like how are they navigating relationships, both in and out of school, so that you can then offer or draw that connection, right, to the work that you're doing. I really like to say, right, I'm not a sex educator, I'm a sexuality educator. And the reason that distinction matters is because sex is a thing that some people do with another person, but sexuality is somebody's relationship with themselves, and that is universal. And Also, Khadijah mentioned like, how do you work within a community? I know there's also some schools that we work with where they have abstinence until marriage classes. And so the students in those classes, they still get some talking from us on identity. And again, these important pieces of building your own relationship, but they don't get all of the information. And do I wish that they still knew that condoms existed? Yes, but that is a way of still trying to work with or come alongside the needs or concerns of those parents or that community.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions at the moment, but we do have a few more minutes. So while people think of any follow-up questions or anything they'd like to add before we hop off, I'll just give a little rundown of just follow-up. Like I said at the beginning, an evaluation will be sent out later this afternoon, as well as I will pop it into the chat shortly. But we obviously want to thank both of our presenters for being here today. It was a wonderful presentation, and I know you've got some comments in the chat about people enjoying it, so make sure you check those out on your own. But yeah, I will just give it another minute or so, just if people have any follow-up questions, comments, or concerns that they want to address before we pop off. I am not seeing any more questions. Again, we do have some lovely thoughts in the comment section about this wonderful presentation, and I agree with them. So with that being said, thank you again to our presenters and our audience for taking the time to be here today and listening to how we can transform conversations with youth. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing everyone in the future on other webinars and projects.